I'm in the Kidron Valley in Jerusalem to better understand who Jesus of Nazareth was by examining what scholars believe is the earliest account of his life, the Gospel of Mark. In this episode, we'll seek to determine who was ultimately responsible for the death of Jesus. It's a crucial question. In answering it, we'll walk on the very street that Jesus walked the night after he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we'll also visit the places where Jesus was most likely tried, condemned, and sentenced to death. There are only a few places in Jerusalem where we know that Jesus actually walked. This is one of those places. It's a modern staircase built over the ancient path that led up from the Kidron Valley to Jerusalem. Jesus walked this very way the night he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. In fact, at the top of this staircase, we even see the remains of the staircase that was here 2,000 years ago. But Jesus and his captors were not the only people to walk this way that night. Mark tells us that Peter, true to his professed loyalty to Jesus, doubled back and no doubt in the shadows walked this way himself that night. The remains of the ancient staircase in which Jesus walked that night lead up to an area in Jerusalem known as the Western Hill, a place where in the 1970s, archaeologists discovered the remains of the homes of the most powerful and wealthy priestly families in Jerusalem, the area where Jesus was taken to be interrogated the night he was arrested. The ancient steps are referred to today as the Caiaphas steps, since they're thought to have led to the house of Caiaphas. To see the homes of the Jewish priests, we have to visit the Wool Museum. It's located in what today is known as the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. The Wool Museum does not look like much from the outside, but inside is spectacular. As we descend the stairs 10 to 15 feet below the street, we go back 2,000 years in time to the ruins of homes of the powerful priestly families that date back to the time of Jesus. Even though these homes are not entirely restored, it's still obvious that they were extremely spacious and lavishly decorated with pillars and capitals. Many of the floors feature intricately designed geometrical patterns, and around the rooms are restored pieces of the elegantly crafted furniture that were once part of these homes. The people living here clearly had expensive tastes. On these walls are the remains of the frescoes and the stucco, with the rich colors still visible after 2,000 years. Amid the ruins, we can also see the remains of the fire that destroyed these homes when the Romans sacked and burned the city to the ground in AD 70, like this charred beam that collapsed when the house was destroyed. How do we know that these were the homes of powerful priestly families in Jerusalem, and not just wealthy individuals? There are actually several indications. The first is location. Although it's hard to recognize it here because modern buildings have been erected over this site, these homes were literally right across from the temple. So you have to envision these homes having a spectacular view of the entire temple complex right from their windows. They are also close to the bridge that also gave priests special access to the temple. The second reason has to do with the type of vessels they found at this site. I'm not talking about the typical pottery vessels that we find scattered across all the sites in Israel. The vessels discovered here were very different. Surprisingly, many of the vessels found in these houses were made of stone, including large pieces of furniture like the stone table we saw earlier. These vessels were much harder to make and extremely expensive because they'd have to be made from a single stone. They were, however, the vessels of choice for the priests, since according to Jewish tradition, they could not become contaminated with ritual impurity. As we've seen before, issues of purity were a significant concern in first century Judaism. People could become ritually impure for a variety of reasons and be unable to go to the temple for a specific period of time until they could become ritually pure once again. This was a particular concern for priests who served in the temple on a regular basis. They wanted to be in a state of constant ritual purity, and they believed that stone vessels could help them achieve that. Let me explain what I mean. If someone found a bug in a regular ceramic cup or a dead rodent in a typical ceramic storage vessel, Jews believed that those vessels had become ritually impure, and therefore anyone that used those vessels would also become impure themselves. Those vessels couldn't be washed, they could only be thrown away. But since Jews believed that stone was an impervious substance, they believed that stone vessels could be used again and again and again without ever becoming ritually impure. This meant that a priest could use a stone vessel without ever having to fear that somehow he might become accidentally impure. Now, of course, this was not a concern for your regular Jew, but it was a particular concern for the priest. And so the presence of so many of these stone vessels in these homes is a clear indication that these were the homes of priests. But there's even a clearer indication that these were the homes of priests. The other feature that identifies these homes as belonging to priestly families is the presence of Jewish ritual baths, like the mikvot at Qumran and Gamla. Purity law connected to the holiness of the temple required people to immerse in water before entering the Temple Mount. In these homes, archaeologists have found a total of 10 private mikvot, indicating that priests must have lived here. I want to show you one more thing that I think you'll find even more interesting. As beautiful as all these homes are, one house in particular stands out due to its unusually large size, 6,500 square feet, and nearly double that size if we consider that the living space was built on 3 levels. Archaeologists refer to it as either the palatial mansion or the Herodian mansion. But like the other homes, this home was not the mansion of merely a wealthy family. The presence of 4 mikvot indicated it was the villa of a very wealthy priestly family. In fact, it might even be the house of Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time of Jesus. The first century historian, Josephus, tells us that Annas had a spectacular home in this area, and that it was burnt to the ground when the Romans conquered the city in the year 70. Annas was the high priest for 10 years, and was referred to as the high priest even after the Romans forced him to resign. In fact, he was so influential that 5 of his sons served as high priests after him. The youngest of his sons, also called Annas, was the high priest who sentenced James, the brother of Jesus, to be stoned to death. Annas was also the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, who was the official high priest who condemned Jesus to death. So this is the house. Let's go inside. After entering through the foyer, there's a beautiful reception hall for entertaining guests on the left. The modern pillars supporting the buildings above the museum today make it difficult to see how large the room actually is. You can still see the remains of the white stucco that covered the walls of the reception hall and the decorative band of geometrical patterns that runs along the perimeter of the room just below the ceiling. During the excavation, archaeologists found fragments of ornate decorative tiles that once covered the entire ceiling. With its elaborate decorations, the reception hall was meant to impress its guests with the wealth and power of its owner, and it certainly would have done just that. On the other side of the foyer is a smaller room, beautifully decorated, with red and yellow plaster walls and elaborate frescoes. At the center of the home, there's a large paved courtyard. There were originally rooms on each side of the courtyard, and there's a stairway in the corner of the courtyard that led down to the lower levels of the home. While we don't know if this was actually the house of Annas, it's an ideal location to envision what would have happened to Jesus that night. Jesus was either taken to this house right here, or at the very least, one like it nearby, destroyed or perhaps not yet discovered. Mark's account of the trial of Jesus is the shortest of all the Gospels. He does not identify any of the Jewish leaders by name. He merely says that Jesus was led to the high priest, and all the chief priests, elders, and the scribes came together. It's only in the later Gospels that we learn that the two main individuals were Annas and Caiaphas. And it's only in John's Gospel that we're told that Jesus was first taken to the house of Annas and then later brought before Caiaphas. Mark has no interest in all these details. His sole interest is on Jesus and how the events of that night reveal Jesus' identity. The layout of this home fits well with what Mark writes about that night. Mark notes that Peter entered right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Many people envision that the courtyard was a place outside, something like a backyard of a modern home today. But that was not the case. As this house makes clear, the courtyard was actually a place within the house, a secure and common area with an open roof in the middle of the home. It was a place where food could be cooked over an open fire, where kids could play, people visit, and animals could stay. Peter was here in the courtyard, probably trying to stay in the shadows as Jesus was being interrogated in the reception hall. Since a large number of the ruling religious authorities had been gathered together that night, the room where Jesus was interrogated and eventually condemned would have had to have been a very large room, like the reception hall right across from the courtyard. Mark makes it clear that the purpose of the meeting was not to determine whether Jesus was guilty or innocent. If that had been the purpose, they would have simply detained him and then tried him in the morning. The fact that they held the meeting at night indicates the fear they had of Jesus and of his popularity with the crowds. They simply could not take the chance that he might get away. In fact, as far as they were concerned, the verdict was already decided. Jesus needed to be put to death. The only thing that needed to be determined was the charge to be brought against him. But this is where Mark says they ran into trouble. The testimony of the witnesses who spoke against Jesus did not agree, so they could not render a verdict against him.
Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' Yet even about this their testimony did not agree."
Worried that the failure to bring a sustainable charge against Jesus might result in him escaping from their grasp, the high priest took matters into his own hands. And it's here that the earliest gospel reveals a distinct insight about the identity of Jesus.
And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But he remained silent and made no answer.
Mark highlights the point that Jesus is strangely quiet amidst the tumult of the kangaroo court around him. One would normally think that a person in Jesus' position would be doing everything he could to save himself. He should be begging for mercy, apologizing for his actions, or in the very least, attempting to defend himself. Yet according to Mark, Jesus does none of these things. Instead, he says absolutely nothing. Frustrated with Jesus' silence and hoping that Jesus might incriminate himself, the high priest stands and he asks Jesus a direct question about his identity. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" This question cuts to the center of the issue. It's a question about identity. Who does Jesus think he is? And how does he understand his mission? Since the word Christ is a Greek translation of the Hebrew word for Messiah, this is a question about whether or not Jesus understands himself to be the promised Messiah. As we've seen, the question of Jesus' identity has been a concern for Mark from the very beginning of his gospel. Who is Jesus of Nazareth? In all the stories Mark has told up to this point, Jesus has always been cautious when addressing the issue of his identity in public. He silenced the demons when they recognized him in Mark chapter 1. And instead of referring to himself as the Messiah, Jesus preferred the title the Son of Man. It's only by implicitly acknowledging Peter's confession, and in the one rare occasion when speaking to his disciples in the privacy of a home, that Jesus actually accepted the title Messiah, or the Christ. While Jesus has been cautious with his words, we've seen in earlier episodes that his actions had increasingly clear messianic implications. The manner in which Jesus entered Jerusalem and his actions in the temple had stirred up the messianic hopes of the common people, and Jesus had done nothing to discourage the reaction. Now the high priest wants a clear answer from the mouth of Jesus himself. For the first time since he was arrested, Jesus finally breaks his silence. I am the Messiah. Why was Jesus so forthright that night, at a time when many would have backed away? This is a decisive point in the earliest Gospel's account of Jesus' life, and it's an important point that Mark wants us to consider. At this point in Jesus' ministry, he no longer needs to conceal his identity. The events that are taking place are not a surprise to him. On the contrary, things are taking place just as Jesus anticipated. Jesus knew that his answer that night would set off a chain of events that would ultimately result in his condemnation. But that's just the path Jesus determined to walk in the Garden of Gethsemane. Outraged at the audacity of Jesus' answer, the high priest tears his garments and he calls for a verdict. In his opinion, Jesus was guilty of blasphemy, an offense that included conduct that was disrespectful of God, but also insulting of his appointed leaders. While Jesus courageously and faithfully confesses his identity as the Messiah, Mark tells us that Peter, moved by fear, denies his identity. Jesus, however, shows no fear. Though he stands before the single most powerful religious authority in all Judea, Jesus remains faithful to his convictions. Peter, on the other hand, is faithless before those who have no significant power that he needs to fear. Although the religious authorities finally had the death verdict that they wanted, there was still one obstacle that stood in their way of getting rid of Jesus. They needed to get Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, to ratify their verdict and to authorize their crucifixion. But based on their past history with Pilate, it was going to be very difficult to get him to do what they wanted him to do. Although the Roman military and administrative headquarters for all of Judea were located about 75 miles away from Jerusalem, in the beautiful coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, the Roman governor would come here to Jerusalem about 3 or 4 times a year. During those times, he would stay in the plush accommodations of the palace built by Herod the Great, the remains of which are found here today in Jerusalem in what is known as the Citadel of David. From the moment Pilate arrived in Judea in the year 26, he clashed with the ruling religious authorities. 2 contemporary Jewish historians tell us that Pilate was arrogant, stubborn, and cared little about the Jews and their beliefs. The Jewish rulers, in return, strongly disliked Pilate. Now, however, they needed his help to condemn Jesus. And as it turns out, Pilate was not far away. He was residing here at Herod's palace in Jerusalem with extra troops to make sure a Jewish revolt did not break out during the celebration of the Passover. Mark's account of what happened is short, but very significant.
And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed.
The main issue in Jesus' trial before Pilate is again the question of Jesus' identity. Who is Jesus of Nazareth? If Jesus harbored any chance of escape, this was his last opportunity. Pilate was the most powerful man in all of Judea, and he held the power of life and death in his hands. All Jesus needed to do was to deny the charges. But Jesus doesn't do that. He simply says to Pilate, "You have said so." Pilate quickly recognized that something wasn't right. He had been in this position many times before with prisoners, but he had never experienced anything like this. Prisoners always begged for mercy, defended themselves, or defiantly lashed out with anger. Jesus, however, did none of these things. Pilate began to wonder if he was being played. Why would the Jewish religious authorities so willingly turn Jesus over to him? It was obvious Jesus was not a typical revolutionary. Something wasn't right. He just couldn't figure out what it was. He needed to find some way out of this, without giving the chief priests what they wanted. Pilate thought he might be able to regain control of the situation by releasing Jesus on the basis of a custom, where as a token of goodwill, the governor would release a prisoner in connection to the Jewish Passover.
But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified.
After being beaten and mocked by Pilate's soldiers, Jesus was forced to carry his cross down this street. But in those days, this street led outside the city gate into the place of execution. Jesus was then nailed to the cross through his wrists and ankles, and then crucified between two thieves. Despite the Jews, who Pilate felt had manipulated him, Pilate instructed a sign be hung identifying Jesus as the King of the Jews. So who was ultimately responsible for the death of Jesus? Through the centuries, many have cast the blame upon the Jewish people, using that blame to justify all kinds of horrible acts committed against them. But placing the blame upon the Jews is certainly misguided. According to Mark's Gospel, Jesus was popular among the Jewish people of his day. And so if any of the Jews from long ago were to be blamed, it would certainly only be the religious authorities who carefully plotted his death. Others, however, would place the blame upon the Romans. They note that if it wasn't for Pilate's decision to turn a blind eye to injustice and to follow the path of political expedience, Jesus would not have had to have been crucified that day. But according to Mark's Gospel, neither of those answers matches the evidence. Jesus could have tried to escape into the darkness the night he was arrested on the Mount of Olives. He could have also tried to defend himself against the chief priests and the Romans. But in every single instance, Jesus chose not to flee or to save himself. In fact, the way Jesus responded only encouraged the actions against him when he did speak. In the end, the only answer that agrees with the evidence is that Jesus wanted to die. He believed it was his destiny. He believed that as the Messianic King, he was called to fight the enemies of God's people. And for him, the real enemy was not the Romans, or even Israel's failed leaders. It was the far greater power of evil in the world. He believed that the battle could only be won by taking upon himself the full weight of evil, so that its force would be completely exhausted on him. He could not bring redemption to Israel without allowing evil to run its full course. God's kingdom of love, justice, truth, and peace could not be established until the injustice, evil, and violence of this world was seen for what it really was and had been spent on him. These were the real forces masquerading behind the corrupt practices of the temple priests and the power politics and the injustice manifest in Pilate. Jesus sought to expose them for what they were and to defeat them in the process. Jesus believed that in laying down his life, he was fulfilling the role of the suffering servant described in Isaiah 53.
Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed.
It was because Jesus saw himself as the suffering servant in Isaiah, and the Passover lamb whose life was given so that people could be delivered, that he chose not to speak up to save himself. For in not speaking, Jesus believed that he was fulfilling the prophetic words of Isaiah 53:7.
He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth.
Jesus was the Passover lamb, and in his death he was assuming upon himself the consequences of Israel and the world's decision to turn away from God and to follow after evil, which brought with it condemnation and death. The only thing Mark records Jesus as saying during his crucifixion is the first phrase of Psalm 22.
And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?
In these final words, Jesus experiences the cup of God's judgment against the power of evil and sin that he accepted in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's the path that he chose. He believed that he was the suffering servant of Isaiah who was laying down his life for the people of God. But what are we to make of these final words of Jesus and of his death on the cross? Do they indicate that in the end, his death was really all for nothing? Was it merely a mistaken understanding of God's will for his life? A misguided dream that went so tragically wrong? Or did his death really change everything? Join me next time as we seek to answer these final questions in our last episode.